Like many of you, I have been on the Alireza Firouzja train for a while, and I am loving seeing him finally get to play some of the top players in the chess world. Tata Steel was amazing, and this next week we have the Prague International Chess Festival, where he'll again be playing mini 2700s. I think that he is the strongest and most impressive prodigy since Carlsen, Kasparov, Fischer. I just named the three greatest players of all time, so that's really quite a lot of praise, but I think what he's doing so far really merits that kind of discussion. So I've been looking back at some of his games over the past few years. I think that when you're a junior, there are a lot of great games that you play that get missed because as you're coming up, you're not yet playing in the super scrutinized super tournaments. And I found a bunch of really fun games from Alireza, and I'm going to look at them in the channel over the next few days. This first one here features an amazing finish against a women's international master from Romania. So jumping back here to the beginning of the game, we're going to zip through the early stage of the game. Alireza likes to play a lot of aggressive openings. He's like Fischer and Kasparov in that regard, and he does open up here with the King's Indian defense, and his opponent responds with the same-ish, which is the sturdy system that has the f3 pawn holding up the white center. Now, after some natural developing moves, we get c5, kicking at the center, and eventually d5, and that's always going to invite a later pawn to e6, which we get right now from black. And at some point, you're going to see an exchange here on d5, and after a recapture with either the e or the c pawn, you are changing over to a Benoni structure, one of Mikhail Tal's favorite openings, something we've looked at a lot on this channel already. So here we do get that after the move bishop e2 and then the exchange here. You can sometimes take back with the e pawn, but I think white is ill set up to do that. In this particular case, you're inviting a lot of attack on the e file, so we do get the more traditional CD. Pawn a6, thinking about b5, which black loves to play, and of course white should almost always respond with pawn to a4, stopping that b5 break. Now, after bishop d7, a5, b5, when you get the pawn on a5 against a b pawn, black is going to push at some point most of the time. And after an exchange through en passant here, Google en passant if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But in any case, what happens here is we get a weak pawn on b2 for white and a weak pawn on a6 for black. So both players get a little bit of something out of this, and the game just remains very interesting and dynamic. I think this probably favors black because the pressure on the long diagonal with this great g7 bishop is, I think in this case, a little more serious than the pressure on a6, but it's balanced. I think black is just getting a decent opening position. Rook a2, bishop b5, we get an exchange here. We're going to zip through the coming moves. We're seeing a contest for the a file. Queen b7 is making sure that black doesn't surrender the a file. Now we get knight back to d7, bishop d2, c4, classic move here. Thinking about holding on to the d3 square, maybe plopping a knight in there, and now we get pawn to f4. So I just said we were thinking about plopping a knight into d3. Why not plop a knight into d3 right now? This is very good for Alireza. I zipped through the last several moves, but they've been in Alireza's favor. He's been making progress and his opponent has not been. And if he jumps into d3 after an exchange here, then black is just better. You might be worried that you're losing this pawn, but you have a lot of play over here. You have the c5 square putting pressure on this e4 pawn. You can play f5 to chip away at the middle of the board. Actually, f5 looks really good very soon, partially because you're probably going to win d5, which will help you keep d3. In any case, all of this is complex, but favorable to black. However, Alireza goes off the deep end a little bit. I think that a lot of young players will do this sometimes when they're in an interesting position like this and they see an interesting continuation. They might go for it, even though it's not the best available. And now Alireza is going to win white's queen and create a super complex position, but it's not necessarily one that's favorable to him. And he had an easy option right here. So we get knight c5 here. Pawn takes on e5, knight to b3. So big move right here. You're attacking the queen and you're attacking the d2 bishop. This is the whole point of the sacrifice of the knight on e5 that Alireza just made. Now you get rook takes a8, so black is winning the queen, but after rook takes back on a1, and let's finish here, bishop takes e5, we've concluded our series of captures. This is actually unclear-ish, but unclear in a way that's probably in white's favor, if that makes sense. I think that it's a lot easier for white to win most of these games. If Alireza were playing white, I would feel very good about his chances to win this game. He's a stronger player than his opponent in this game. He has, or white has, a rook and a knight and a bishop against a queen and a pawn. Now, what black has is a really great bishop here and a lot of pressure on the queen side with some very dangerous pawns, and that's going to come up later in the game. But that doesn't mean that black should definitely win here. If white consolidates correctly, the game could easily trend in white's favor, although the computer's saying almost equal now. This is something that white's happy to get because white was really suffering earlier. Anyway, bishop c3, queen b6 check, king over, and then pawn to f6 because you don't want to have to recapture with the d6 pawn. When white has a passed d pawn, you're going to try and recapture on e5 with the f pawn if you have to recapture. So rook f3, and then rook c8, rook c1, bishop d4, rook d1, bishop back to e5. And then here you had an interesting option for white. You could have given back an exchange here, winning the f6 pawn and then keeping your very strong dark squared bishop. This is a favorable continuation for white. You have a big idea of maybe playing pawn to e5 and passing this d pawn up the board. So this looks pretty pleasant. White is actually going to go back and do this later, but in the meantime, black is going to make some kind of progress. So a lot of times when you're in a situation like this where you might need to give back some material, you should do it earlier, especially if you're not sure what your next moves are and your opponent has clear ways to improve the position. Give back the material at an early point in the game rather than holding on to it until you have to give it back after your opponent's made progress. So white actually played here rook c1, which doesn't accomplish much. Rook c7, knight f1, king g7, knight g3, queen c5. We're going to zip through quite a few moves here until eventually white does sack on f6. Again, probably better to have done this earlier without drifting for a little while. After bishop takes f6, white has a big idea here of bringing this bishop over to e6. Rook f7, the bishop starts that journey, and we get rid of this dark squared bishop here, giving back an exchange again and reinstituting the queen and pawn versus rook, knight, and bishop dynamic material imbalance here. And this was important so that the king doesn't get mated by bishop e6 or that black doesn't get bound up and lose even more material. So rook takes, king g7, asking the rook to step back, and then queen d4. This queen, very, very strong. And we mentioned earlier that black has a lot of potential on the queen side. This game now favors black. This has been in black's favor. White doesn't really know what to do with these pieces. Meanwhile, black has a simple idea. I win the b2 pawn, and then I have two connected passed pawns on the queen side, and I win the game. So rook b1, unfortunately a passive necessary defensive move, and now king f6. I love this move. The king and the queen are just going to own the center of the board. Remember just a moment ago when we gave up our dark squared, our rook for the dark squared bishop on f6? White now has no pieces that are in position to contest the dark squares in the center of the board. So this king is just going to run right in. I love this very, very much. So the king steps into e5, knight e2, queen back to a7. This queen is headed here to go after the rook and this b2 pawn. Rook d1, queen a2. There's no way to hold on to this pawn right here. You've also got to watch your back rank. Knight d4. We grab the b2 pawn, and now white is going to try to pass the d pawn. So after that check, the king moves. Pawn comes up, so we're going to make a passed pawn, and the question is, how fast is black's c-pawn? The answer is probably faster, but white actually does have an interesting saving grace here. Pawn c3, and if you want to try and figure out how to save this game, this is the moment to pause your video and figure out how white could have nullified black's c-pawn right here. Well, the way to do it is rook to f1. This is what white does a move later, but a move later is too late. If you do it now, after pawn to c2, you can play bishop d1 check, and you give up your bishop for the pawn right here. Now, this is still promising for black, but it's very, very complicated. You can easily mess this up. White can choose between ed or e6. In both cases, black is pushing, but white's pawn is dangerous, and it's not clear that black has any clear win in this position. Instead, though, white thought that there was a really nice option here. Maybe there was time trouble in the game, I don't know, but there's definitely a miscalculation. After pawn takes d6, c2 here, the idea is I am going to have to let you make a queen, but you can't stop me from queening, right? So rook f1, the move that would have saved white a moment ago, no longer good enough to save the game. And now we got a second queen on the board for black. So really, really unique situation right here. Obviously, there are back rank mates in the air. So the bishop pulls back to d1 with a discovered check that's helping hold the back rank together. The king steps into e3, pawn up, and white is sitting there and going, hey, you can't stop my pawn here. If I make a queen, well, I'm probably actually going to win here. Materially, I'm doing great. And again, you can't stop my queen. So what are you going to play? Another great moment to pause your video just for a few seconds to see if you can find the move that Alireza played right here. The answer is queen f2. This isn't so difficult, but lordy, is it pretty. I love this move. The king and the two queens are dominating, utterly dominating the white back rank in this case. I have never said that before in chess. I don't know of any other game where you can say the king and two queens, the full royal cabinet for black, are dominating the back rank, and this is forcing mate in just a couple of moves. Very, very beautiful stuff. Obviously, there's no way to hold the back rank together. I will show this just because I think it's pretty. If the rook goes to g1, then of course you're just going to give back one of the queens right here, and then you give checkmate. I love that the king on e3 covers the escape square on f2. What a fantastic finishing position, and I'm going to leave it on the board here. It's just too special. So queen f2 in this position. And I should mention, queen f6 would have done the job too, but queen f2 is better, stronger, and prettier. So if you like that game, then of course you should just go ahead and click over here on the chessboard for more Alireza Firouzja games. I'll have some more coming out very soon. And as always, if you like the content, you are welcome to subscribe to the channel if you wanted to do so.